Brilliant. Ooh, this is so cool. Paul Lawrence, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Yannick.
I'm always saying I'm excited about this, but I'm particularly excited about this because, well, first of all, I really like your style. I've listened to quite a few things. Obviously, I've had touch points with your work over the years, and I really appreciate how clear you write about very complex subjects, how you seem to enter a dialogue with people when you present. You've also just explored areas that I really care about. So it's difficult to find something to disagree on, which, always makes for interesting dialogue, I think. But nonetheless, I'm excited about offering a window into your perspective on coaching, because I think you have a lot of really important things to say that coaches who are coming up and coaches who are very experienced also, it's important that they hear this, I think, for the sake of what we're doing as coaches. And there's some sort of perspective in there for me. But I think you're coming in from a position of curiosity and you want to make people question things. And I think that's always good, right? I think that sits at the foundation of good coaching. So hopefully today we'll bring up a lot of questions for people so that they can think about what they're doing as coaches.
Lovely. Thanks, Yannick.
Well, how to introduce you? You've done a lot of research around Oxford Brookes. You've had a long-lasting corporate career. You've been in various leadership positions. You've amassed, nearly 10,000 hours now?
Oh, no, less than that. I think my coaching hours are around 4,500 to 5,000.
Right. So, well, a significant amount. You've done work around the world. You've written a number of books, most notably perhaps in the coaching context, coaching systemically. You've co-authored The Tower of Dialogue, which I'm going to be super curious about. The Wise Leader most recently, obviously. And what else was there? Coaching in 3 dimensions, which I think has a lot to offer for coaches. Is there anything else you wanted to add to this in terms of, by means of introduction, something that you feel would be helpful for people to know from what perspective you're speaking from?
No, I don't think so. I think that was a lovely introduction. Thank you.
No, you're very welcome. I'm talking about tension and how that kind of brings up interesting dialogue. I picked up on something and I wanted to ask you about that. How do you coach Donald Trump?
How do you coach Donald Trump? That was the title of a LinkedIn posting.
Uh-huh.
Like lots of us, I do lots of LinkedIn postings. That one, I think it's the only one that just went viral and people got really stuck into it. My point was, because a lot of people, and this is what happened on the LinkedIn posting, a lot of people will label him as, what do they label him as? All sorts of things, actually. Narcissistic being probably the most popular label. And all I was doing was just contemplating whether there might be an adult development aspect to it. I'm not sure I'm ever going to do that again because, some of the, don't get into politics, I think, because some of the responses were really quite emotional. So I have no idea how you coach Donald Trump. As I said, I was just hypothesizing that it may not be that he's narcissistic, whatever that means. It may be something different. It was about just picking up on what you were saying before, I suppose. It was about being just adopting a somewhat curious mindset to how one might go about coaching him. Maybe he's got a coach. I don't know.
I somehow doubt it. I hope so, because I don't think there's a coach out there who hasn't at some point thought about, I wonder what that would be like. And it's super interesting to think about that just in terms of what agenda is the coach bringing in, because it came up a couple of times with colleagues, and sometimes I hear somebody wants to come in and they want to make the change that they want to create. right? And I think that's a really interesting thing to consider for coaches. What am I coming in with in this conversation? Is this a dialogue, or is this a skilled conversation wanting to create a particular outcome?
That's good. What it reminds me of, you talked about Oxford Brooks, and Tatiana Bachkarova and Peter Jackson they've written a couple of really nice articles on 3Ps. And the articles really are around the coaching supervision space. But I've kind of woven, it's not my model, but I've woven that model into the teaching stuff around coaching and leadership, which says, what is your, on what philosophies is your practice built? What are your values and beliefs and experiences? How, where's the foundation of you as a coach? Why do you coach? And how do you coach? And it's a lovely framework for clarifying who am I as a coach. And if you've got that clarity, I think then you'd be fairly clear about whether or not you wanted to coach Donald Trump and how you might be doing that.
Yeah. And does Donald Trump want to engage in the coaching? But I think we need to take that question out of the question in order to actually have a meaningful thinking session about that.
Yeah. But there is a piece, I do agree with you. There is a piece around, it being somewhat clear about, who am I as a coach? What do I do? How do I do it? Recognizing that there's no right or wrong answer, but being clear on that, because a lot of the stuff around climate change, there are groups of coaches who are kind of gathering together to do something about climate change. And and there's nothing, I'm not criticizing that at all, but it's more a curiosity around, so what's the agenda there? To what extent is that a kind of advocacy agenda, or to what extent is it a coaching agenda, however you're defining coaching? I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And do we come in with an agenda? It's an honorable thing to do something that you really care about and help people on that line. If they choose you for that reason, you're still likely to get involved and maybe challenge less. You're much more likely to collude with your client on something. And I think you're missing out on a perspective that's important when you meet people with that same agenda.
I agree with you. And I think you mentioned the dialogue piece, and I don't know, we might get more into the dialogue piece, but the dialogue, the reason that we wrote the book on dialogue is I was going around just talking to folks about dialogue, and people's eyes would kind of glaze over because, we attach different meanings to different words. And I think people were assuming I was just talking about conversation. I'm talking about, in the book, we talk about dialogue with a very particular slant on what we mean by dialogue, and the kind of what sits at the heart of dialogue. It's not a skill, I don't think. Well, it's partly a skill, but it's the heart. What sits at the heart of our capacity to engage in effective dialogue is our self-awareness, because we all have agendas, right? This notion that coaches go into a conversation agenda-free and our questions are neutral, I don't really think stands up to scrutiny. We come from a place. All our questions come from a place.
Yeah, and there's a fundamental decision in there to become aware of that and maybe put some of that back in the box and try to formulate clean questions. There's a whole approach around clean language. Or whether we allow ourselves to bring ourselves in with our agendas and then have a dialogue on that basis.
Yeah, and that's why I say dialogue is got a lot to do with self-awareness, because you can only make the choice if you're aware of what's going on. And is there such a thing as, I don't know what a clean question is.
For example, if somebody says, I'm really frustrated, to ask, what kind of frustrated is that? What's that for you? Because I'm not coming in with an agenda. I'm not coming in with a bias. I think maybe the way I ask the question, there's probably something in there that's leaning one way or the other based on what I think I know about frustration. But I can make a good effort to say, tell me more about that. And ask that in a way that isn't leading anywhere.
Well, it's going to lead somewhere.
Yeah. In that way, we're always leading, right? Whether we ask a question or whether we hold stillness.
Yeah. Yeah.
But tell us a bit about dialogue. There was a really interesting process involved that led to the Hour of Dialogue. You met with a number of people in a hotel for a couple of days, having dialogues about dialogue. And could you tell us a bit more about how that kind of came about?
Yeah. The first book I wrote wasn't really about coaching. It was called Leading Change. Mm-hmm. And I interviewed 50 leaders around the world to ask not what goes wrong here, but tell me about what goes right. Because all these leaders, I had half of them are CEOs, and some of them weren't CEOs at all, but they worked in really complex spaces. And I had a sense that all of these people had navigated change successfully. So I wanted to know, how did you go about doing that? And what was interesting was none of them mentioned a change model. One of them, that's not quite true. One of them mentioned a change model, but that was a particular instance where that business was about big business, was under the scrutiny from the regulators and was about to be closed down if they didn't do X, Y, and Z. So there was no negotiation. And they went through that process in a very step-like manner and alienated a lot of people, and lots of people left, and they kind of knew that was what was going to happen, and that was okay. But the other 49 leaders did not mention a change model. No Kotter models, no McKinsey model, whatever. But if you kind of did a kind of thematic analysis of what were they doing here, they were engaging in dialogue. In that they were deeply curious, and I love this word curious, and it's coming up more and more often, I think. But they were deeply curious about the organizations in which they worked and beyond the organization, and they said what they felt they needed to say in a respectful manner. And not all of them, but that was the kind of theme that was emerging here, this notion of dialogue. And they had a notion of who they needed to engage dialogue with and who else needed to engage in dialogue in service of the kind of directional change that they were looking for. And I thought that was really interesting. And then I started talking to people about dialogue. And as I said, got some rather disinterested blank looks. And some of the other folks who, friends in the same kind of industry said, yeah, that's how we experience this as well. So, yeah, as you say, 7 of us, I didn't know all of these folks. I knew Andreas really well, I knew Floris, I knew Sarah. And then there were the other folks were friends of Sarah's, but all with that common interest. And we got to it was a hotel in England. I was in England for about 3 weeks or something. And yeah, we got together for 2 days and said, let's just have a dialogue about dialogue and let's see what emerges. There was an intention or a hope. It wasn't an intention. It was a hope that a book might emerge from that process. And so we engaged in dialogue for 2 days, and out popped the model and some of the basic themes that then emerged in the book. And the book is a story. It's a short story. So it's not academic, and it's intended to be very accessible, because that's what we were trying to do, is to try and make this idea of dialogue really accessible. But it was really interesting because we set out with the intention of engaging in dialogue for 2 days and found that we couldn't do it. Which was just a lovely experiment. That amongst the 7 of us, there were times, these lovely moments when we were all kind of in that space, but there were moments when people were kind of not intentionally, but just tuning out and tuning in. So it was very interesting, and it kind of changed my frame on dialogue to being something somewhat linear and intentional to something much more dynamic and fluid and emergent.
Yeah, I talked to Nick Bolton, who runs Animas, about dialogue the other day, and it was interesting that there is a version that I had in my mind around dialogue that is quite playful and explorative. Something that might happen in a coaching session where you still listen, very open mind, see what's emerging, but also saying what needs to be said, what's going on for you. So it's very kind of authentic relationship in that sense, but you don't know where it's going. And for me, that felt quite light and playful in that version of dialogue. And for Nick, it was much more intentional in terms of, I create a dialogue in order to say something that needs to be said. There is a level of discomfort that's always that's always present in dialogue. And I wonder what you think about that.
Well, the first thing I'd say is we all use these words to mean something that's slightly different and somewhat personal. I think that's interesting in itself. And I'm not trying to sort of define dialogue. I'm just kind of sharing my own kind of sense making around dialogue. But to me, dialogue is actually quite a liberating thing in coaching, because dialogue does say, yeah, I'm going to go into this conversation curious. Yes, I've got things going on. This is what we said before, that there's no such thing as a kind of neutral question, but I'm going to do my best to hold those kind of judgments and thoughts, just hold them there, and be conscious of them, and seek to be kind of curious and open-minded around that, and do that to the best of my ability. And the best of my ability is defined to the extent to which I'm aware of what's going on in my head, and then I'm just going to see what happens. And I think the piece around saying what needs to be said, this is one of the pieces that when I was doing kind of webinars and presentations around coaching in 3 dimensions, was one that, again, I think, and including experienced coaches, some found quite liberating, this idea that actually it's my role as a coach also to share what's going on for me. But this isn't about giving advice and telling people, because if I'm in a curious mindset, I'm not going to do that. It's not that I'm trying not to do it. It's just not going. I'm just not going to do it, because it's not the state that I'm in. I'm in a, wow, that's really interesting. Here's what's going on for me. Here's what I'm thinking. Here's what I'm feeling. And of course, there's a whole judgment piece around that when you're coaching, around when that's going to be useful and when it's not going to be useful. You've got some intention in mind. So for me, and then I think about, because I do quite a lot of coach training. Not sure training is the right word, but quite a lot of coaching, skills development, and that's almost, again, I feel that feels like a very liberating place to be, because a lot of coaches, certainly when they first come into coaching, feel that they have to know what to say next. We have to make sure that we get to a solution by the end of the session, all of that kind of stuff, and that's busy, and that gets in the way of dialogue. That takes me on to wisdom, which says, because I don't feel that, but it's not because I'm smart or anything, it's because I've coached a lot, and it has never ever happened to me that I've got to the end of a session and there isn't some kind of insight and intention there sitting there. It's just never happened. So there's a kind of trust in the process. Dialogue, in a sense, is a process, and there's a piece around just kind of trusting the process. And if you trust the process, I like the word playful. It's a lovely, playful space to be. It's quite cool. And because you know that you're creating a space or co-creating a space, which is quite unusual, that the coachee almost certainly doesn't experience terribly often in the day-to-day, work. And it's a very creative space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I love that. I know the moment when I realized I can trust this process, that something always emerges. And I very rarely say always, but every time you enter that kind of space and the space is held well and the other person wants to engage in the space, something always emerges. There's always some form of learning, some form of insight. So I can sit in some comfort in the discomfort of not knowing where this is going, trusting that something will emerge. What a wonderful space to be in.
And I think personally, there are times when there is no discomfort of not knowing where this is going at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that triggers my existential edge around the general discomfort when we tune into it. But I think I'd agree. Often I'm not aware that there is any discomfort about uncertainty because I've learned to be more comfortable with uncertainty. I want to take that curiosity as a window into the coaching in 3 dimensions. There's a wonderful section in the introduction to the book, Coaching in 3 Dimensions, that Jennifer wrote, Garvey Berger. She says, it's hard to read this book without reaching the ultimate goal that Paul and Ellen want more than anything: your increasing sense of curiosity about what's possible for you and your clients and for the entire field of coaching. If you believe that coaching is it's critical to the future of our organizations, and that organizations are critical to the future of our planet, you need to read this book and understand what the future of coaching might look like. I thought that was really significant and seems to really capture something. So I wonder if you could say a bit more about, the curiosity is a given here. You've already highlighted that. But I wonder about the role of organizations in the future of our planet and why coaching is so important. What needs to happen in coaching in order to make that happen, or to support that?
Yeah, well, of course, those are Jennifer's words, and Jennifer's a beautiful writer. So those are her words. My interpretation of that would be, and here I find myself at times wondering just how useful the kind of concept of coaching actually is. And of course, that depends on how you define coaching. And the curiosity to me is around being totally open to, what we're doing and where it might go, and trying to put aside the conversation around trying to be terribly clear about what coaching is and what it isn't and what you need to do and all of that kind of stuff. So to me, again, they're Jennifer's words, but to me, organizations, it's about everybody. To what extent are we all good at really being able, exactly what we talked about before, being able to recognize our own prejudice? We've all got prejudices, our own beliefs, etc., etc. To what extent are we good at being able to put those aside and really hear where the other person is coming from? That doesn't mean we're agreeing with them, but to what extent are we really committed to understanding where they come from? And to what extent are we good at really sharing what's going on for us in a way that is respectful? And that last bit of the sentence is the bit that's really important, in a way that's respectful. And if you can imagine that if everybody in the world was just super good at really wanting to understand where everybody else was coming from, and if everybody else was super good at giving feedback in a way that was respectful, wouldn't the world be a much better place? And in that sense, you see, and that's kind of how I would define coaching. I don't, when I do coaching skills work, I don't kind of refer to 12 competencies or 15 competencies or whatever. My own, and this is just a purely personal perspective on it all, but it says that's what really good coaches are good at. It's the listening and it's the voicing. And of course, there's a piece around structuring a conversation when you're kind of setting out in the coaching world, but that's what we need to be good at. But actually, that's exactly what leaders need to be good at. That's the essence of leadership, I believe. And that's the essence of what it is to be, I think, and this is just personal perspective, that's the essence of what it is to be a really useful member of the human race. So again, I'm just interpreting Jennifer's words, but I think what coaches potentially do is role model that intention. Because the way that we think and what we believe is, whether we're aware of it or not, it's shaped by our interactions with other people. Coaches are in a place where they are, where we are, in this beautiful space where we're actually seeking to, never doing it perfectly, but we're seeking to role model a particular way of being. And that in itself, in ways which are, you don't know what's actually happening, has an influence on the people who you're coaching. If you do group coaching and team coaching, then you have a really quite a wide sphere of influence. And in your own little way, or in our own little way, I think we're making a really quite useful contribution to the world. That's how I would interpret Jennifer's words.
Yeah, and I can not underline this more. I see so many people go through coach training and quite a few of them, they never have a formal coaching session, but they've just become better people, if we can say it in that way. So that maybe better, they become more self-aware, they become better communicators, better listeners. They find themselves in better relationships, because that's essentially what coaching is about. And that goes well beyond a coach and the client. As you say, if a leader has those qualities, they're able to seek dialogue. They're able to be aware of what's going on for them, what they bring into a space when they talk to somebody, what their agendas are, their biases. Put some of that in the box. Know when to open the box and see what's in there. And really engage with people from, a very, very authentic point of view. So I appreciate all the coaches. That's why I find it so meaningful to work with coaches, to train coaches. What coaching schools are doing all over the world is really benefiting communities, workplaces, the world as a whole.
Yeah.
So could you tell us a bit more, because there's something in that is going to help coaches to go beyond. I think Tatiana wrote this, that I heard you speaking critically of the coaching competencies in other places. You kind of touched on it now, and that it's really important, actually, or can be really important, to have a set of competencies to take people from novice to I kind of know what I'm doing here. But that there's something missing, or it's not there's something missing, but the competencies are not enough, certainly, maybe even in the way of getting to that next level of coaching where we can enter those kind of dialogues that you describe here. So you write about kind of what's missing or what would be helpful in order to create that. Could you tell us a bit more about the kind of lenses you would add to this, or the kind of attitude that a coach needs to develop to get to that next level of practice?
Yeah. Okay. So that was, I'm pretty sure that was what Tatiana said in her paper around coaching competencies, but that what you said, which is that they may be useful in helping people kind of access that space. And I agree with that. I think it's like a language that kind of helps us, just especially if you're new to the community, unite around the importance, or align around the importance of listening and some of the other things that are expressed in these competencies. The issue then is, but this does come back to who you are as a coach and your own perspective. And I'm not suggesting mine is the only perspective, but if that's how I view coaching, solely through the terms of competency, then essentially what I'm saying is, whatever situation I find myself in, my task here is to decide which of these, however many competencies it is, I need to bring to bear in order to be helpful. That's what we're saying. We're saying that's what coaches do. They do these 12 competencies, and if I sign you off on those 12 competencies, then you're a brilliant coach. And what the coaching associations do is but here's the issue. They don't only define the kind of entry level, or whatever you want to call it, entry level competence in terms of competence. Some of them then go on to say, well, if you want to be at this level or this level or this, and I'm not really sure what these levels mean, but if you want to be, whatever level it is, then you need to display those competencies even better than the others. So the whole thing, the whole kind of notion of coach development becomes expressed solely in terms of competence. That's the issue. And to be fair to the coaching associations, I think certainly the folks I've spoke to, and I know some folks in the ICF and the AC very well. I'm not sure that they would argue with that. I think they'd say, but it's really quite difficult to define what next in a way that you can then measure. And my personal belief around that is then, why try? But that's a whole other thing. There's a lot of stuff. There's some lovely stuff written. I like a lot of Ralph Stacey's stuff, and he talks about practice in the leadership. He hasn't written very much about coaching, but he's written a lot about leadership, and he talks about practical judgment, and that reminds me of the literature around wisdom, which says, I learn through doing and the reflection on my doing. I learn through my doing and the reflection on my doing. And so the more I coach, So first off, that says I might have 5,000 coaching hours. That doesn't make me a good coach, because it's the experience and the reflection on the doing. And so that says to me that, and why? Because the world is complex. We can't, personal belief, you can't break down every circumstance that you're going to find yourself as a leader and coach into these kind of generic situations and then say we can match competency 3, 6, and 7. There's something about us facing all sorts of different scenarios and learning through doing about what works and what doesn't work. And there's something around in that process that our own perspective on what we're doing shifts and changes. And that takes us into the kind of argument around horizontal development and vertical development. So there's all the literature around adult development, which I think is really cool, which says it's not just about competence, it's about the way you actually look at the world. The systemic stuff in the coaching systemic book is also about, I'm not going to call it vertical development, but it's about accessing different ways of thinking, and those different ways of thinking just fundamentally change our perspective on the world. And as a coach, those fundamental accessing different perspectives means we're going to ask different kinds of questions, and we're going to have an impact on our coachees in that way. So that then says, okay, how do you measure all that? Personally, I don't know that we have to, but there's something in there around the commitment to learn, and there's something in there around our own interest and awareness of our own perspective taking, and there's something in there about our reflective practice and how we reflect. Yeah. I'm going on a bit here, but the reflective piece, my partner, Susie Skinner, has just finished her PhD on reflection, and I thought what was really interesting about that, because we go on about you need to reflect, it says, yeah, you need to reflect, but the key differentiator between really impactful leaders and not so impactful leaders isn't just about do they reflect, it's how do they reflect. Mm-hmm. So what's our commitment to learning, and how good are we at learning?
Yeah, I want to go a little bit deeper in that, because I'm waving the flag for supervision quite a lot, just as a really effective, well, depends on the supervisor, but really effective way of getting into a process of reflecting, right? Yeah. Enter a reflective space where you can also have somebody there who is doing all the things that a coach can do for any other practice, but somebody who helps you reflect on what you're doing as a coach, how you're thinking, opening doors into looking at things from other angle, other perspectives, opening systemic lenses, offering something that is a really helpful way to do exactly that, reflect on your practice. So could you say a little bit more about what's a good way of reflection?
I did some research on the state of supervision in Australia quite a long time ago now, about 8-9 years. And I'll never forget, one person said to me, why would I need supervision? It was at a time when people were questioning, why supervision? And I think that was a somewhat, and I was kind of asking why supervision, because you had, certainly in Sydney, and every market's different, but in Sydney you've got a Sydney Masters program being offered by a psychology department, and there's you had a lot of folks coming from the therapy space and the psychology space saying, of course you need supervision, and a lot of coaches saying, yeah, but we're not therapists and we're not psychologists, so why do we need to do supervision? So there was a real questioning around it, and one of the people I interviewed said, why would I need supervision? I've been coaching for 20 years. Who's going to teach me anything?
Interesting how you phrased the question.
Well, there's a lot. Yeah, I thought, wow, hang on. Surely there's always something to learn, and supervision to me essentially is a learning process. And that just ties into what we were talking before around reflection, which says to me, I just think anybody who is through the lens that I've described around complexity and the need to access different perspectives to be useful in a world that's just becoming more and more complex, that we surely then need to be really kind of almost compelled to want to know more about ourselves and about other perspectives. And that's where I think supervision has a really cool role to play in coaching. And if we don't like the word supervision, then call it something else. The last part of what you said was about how to reflect, and this comes from this was partly Susie's stuff, but also some stuff that comes out of the wisdom literature, which says the how piece is around to what extent in my reflecting am I wanting to learn more about myself. And the differentiator was in that study, which is the people who were measured to be wise, and put aside the challenge of measuring wisdom, but the people who were kind of measured to be wise wanted to know, they wanted feedback. They were really curious about themselves and what more they could learn about themselves in relation to others. That's where this starts to go into the system space. You in relation to others. There were other people who were reflecting, but there were barriers up against the me stuff, and so the paradigm. This sounds quite obvious when I say it, but what was coming from the wisdom literature was you can reflect all you like. That isn't going to make you wiser. That isn't going to help you learn necessarily. It depends on why are you doing it and how. And the why you're doing it, it's what they're basically saying is, I want supervision, or I want to reflect because I want to challenge myself to become somebody even better than I am now.
Yeah. And I really want to underline that for a moment, because I see that a lot. Coaches coming to supervision to want to learn something about the client, or they want to learn how can they produce better results, or they want to be taught something. They want to they want to be given something because he is somebody senior or somebody with more experience, and there might be something to learn in that way. To learn something about myself, you're entering a vulnerable space, especially when you're a coach with 20 years experience, because there might be some things, you know, you need to revisit just by opening that door. And that can feel quite vulnerable. So I appreciate everybody who's coming to supervision, everybody entering any learning space, because it can be a vulnerable space with a lot of uncertainty. And as you said earlier, like for some people, it's not uncomfortable at all, because we already have that attitude of curiosity. But for a lot of people, that it takes a lot of courage to enter a learning space, because they're being faced with new things that, you know, cause some uncertainty and discomfort.
Well, we've all got things about ourselves that I think we have. I have anyway. That I'm not terribly sure that we want to kind of bring up and address. And this isn't therapy, but the things that we want up and bring and address in order to understand how we can become a better coach or a better leader. Mm-hmm. I agree with you.
Yeah. I talked to Robin Short a couple of weeks ago, and one of his questions he offers is, what do you not want your supervisor to know about you? And I thought that was a brilliant question to reflect on.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah.
Good. Where do we go next? I'd love to talk about transformation, and we've already talked about change processes a little bit. In the context of wise leadership, you touched on this a couple of times also. I'd love to just kind of put a flashlight on this. And I guess the way I would want to phrase the question is around transformation. What does it take for a leader to transform to becoming wise? And what's the role of coaching in that? Maybe we need to start with what is a wise leader, and I'll let you see where you take that question.
Yeah, let's do that. But I guess the piece I'm just reacting to is as almost a tangential piece, but is this piece around transformation. And again, I love Tatiana's work, but she did a beautiful presentation at University of Sydney just before COVID, and wrote a paper with a colleague around this transformation as a dangerous idea.
Say some more.
Yeah, well, it says And I think this is really interesting stuff. So it says, I need to be a little bit careful about myself as a coach, because if my purpose is to help people transform, then how useful am I being? Because if I go in, let's say I go to a Coachee and say, I'm a coach, and what I'm really good at is helping people transform, then what I've straight away done is I've kind of quite possibly set that person a hurdle, which they now need to jump over, else risk failing, which is now I need to transform. So I need to become somehow qualitatively or quantitatively significantly different to the way I am now. And I kind of agree with Tatiana that says, I'm not sure that's a useful frame to hold ourselves up for as a coach. So I say that. Then the wisdom piece. So if I'm
can I jump in there for a moment? Because it strikes me that it's important how that relationship comes to be. If somebody says, this is the kind of work that I'm doing, and then people who have that desire, they seek them out, I think that makes a lot of sense. If you get paired up as part of an organization or something like that, or you introduce yourself like that later, I can totally see that this can be quite risky because of exactly what you said.
Yeah, it's as you say, it's around the setup and it's around the contracting. But again, if I'm a coachee in an organization, and the reason I'm doing coaching is because somebody said, if you want to be a partner in this firm, then there needs some sort of transformation that needs to take place, and the coach, rubs their hands and goes, "Oh, good, I do transformation." Then, in that context, as a coachee, I'm not sure how helpful that is. If I'm saying I really want to transform, come on, coach who does transformation work, then maybe that's different.
I'm thinking of a weight loss coach in order to be a better leader. And all of a sudden there's an implication that, in order to be a great leader, you need to lose some weight just because no. But yeah, it struck me as funny.
So with the wisdom stuff, so what do you want to know about the wisdom stuff?
So, I mean, how do leaders become wise? Because I'd love to put a frame around wisdom in some meaningful way so people kind of know what we're talking about. But I think a lot of coaches would want, not just leaders, but, their clients in general to become wise. And you touched on a few points already. I think it's quite desirable to become that. So for some, that might mean a transformation. For others, that might be an evolution. For some, it might be tweaking a few things. But I wonder if you could tell us about that change process that leads to wisdom and the role of coaching in that.
And by the way, some people may already be wise. Okay, first, wisdom. So I've started writing about wisdom, and I think for a few reasons. One, because, as I said, we talk about horizontal versus vertical leadership, and I think that's a really cool discussion. I also think it's somewhat narrow. I think it's because when we talk, the communities that I'm a part of, when they start talking about vertical development, the conversation is often, if not usually, about the adult development theories. And adult development theories are brilliant, but I suspect the agenda is somewhat broader than that. The other reason, so it's how do we capture something, or what's the concept that's going to help us talk about the world beyond competence? The other piece is just looking around the world at the map. I don't want to pick on world. You've already mentioned Donald Trump, so I'll mention Donald Trump. But there's other folks. Donald Trump talks a lot about his IQ, and there's a statistic which I read in the Cambridge, the Cambridge Handbook of Wisdom, that said, I probably won't get the numbers right, but in our IQ levels seem to go up by, is it 10 points a century or something like that. But our IQ rates are steadily rising. The average IQ rate is rising quite significantly. And yet we seem to be, and this is just a personal perspective, but we don't seem to be very good. It's not just the world. We're not very good at managing pandemic. We're not very good at managing international differences. I mean, Brexit was a shambles. I mean, we're just not very good at this stuff, but we're cleverer than we've ever been. So it says, you know, there needs to be a narrative here beyond competence and beyond intelligence. And wisdom seems to me to be a lovely frame that we can start talking about. Now we need the fact to referring back to what you just said. Okay, now we need to define wisdom. And wisdom is the same as coaching, and it's the same as leadership. There are lots and lots and lots of different definitions. But what I'm interested in the wise leader stuff is marrying some of the ideas that come out of the wisdom literature with some of the ideas that are coming out of the leadership literature, particularly some of the psychological dimensions of leadership, and seeing if what emerges is useful. So you asked me, how do I define wisdom? Well, there's lots of definitions of wisdom, but if you look in the wisdom literature and you look in the psych literature around leadership, there's a few themes that pop up there. And one is exactly the conversation we've had around learning and reflection. And so one definition, and this is coming from the wisdom, I'm referring to wisdom literature, I'm not just making this up. There's in the wisdom literature, it talks about one of the characteristics of a wise person is that they are open, they are curious, they are committed to learn. There's a second theme in the wisdom literature around self-awareness. However, I think about a lot of the stuff in the leadership space, which I'm not sure is terribly useful around. I mean, this notion of authenticity and single self, it's actually a very simplistic construction on self. And so here's an opportunity to bring in some of the multiplicity stuff around self-awareness, which, whether you believe in multiplicity or not, it's a much richer, more in-depth, less simplistic exploration around self. Ties up lovely to the wisdom literature. As I've said already,
we're talking multiple selves. We're talking about internal family systems kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
The idea that we don't have one self and that's us, there's multiple parts.
Yes, that's right. Now, you look in the leadership space, there are narratives that say authenticity is about understanding yourself.
Mm-hmm.
There is an alternative definition of authenticity. And that means, and so what can happen within that is we get these conversations about dismiss self-doubt, because self-doubt's your enemy. Dismiss this, dismiss that, and focus on your single self. My own perspective on that is it's not terribly helpful. Mm-hmm. The multiplicity perspective says that you actually have multiple cells, and pushing these cells away is almost the exact opposite of what you need to do to become more authentic, because to become more authentic is to get to know those cells and embrace them in an acknowledgement of your multiplicity of self. And that's to your point, that's the Richard Sharp stuff around internal family systems.
Yeah, and it can seem paradoxical because, like, if I'm multiple selves, how can I be authentic? But it actually makes a lot of sense once you wrap your head around I'm a different kind of person in different kind of situations, and it makes a lot of sense if that were to come from different selves that kind of all reside in me, and there's a self with a capital S, as Richard calls it, that is actually the one in charge ultimately. There is a self with that.
Yeah. Well, so authenticity is described differently in the multiplicity as the extent to which my cells know each other and get on with each other. Now, there's lots of different multiplicity theories, and some of them say there is no overarching self, that there are just the cells. Then there are theories like Richard's that say, yes, there is a kind of self. Tatiana, again, has written a book on adult development where she's got her own theory of multiple cells and talks about the narrator, which kind of marries into the work on split brain theory and so on, and the idea of, what is it called, the left hemisphere interpreter. Anyway, that's the self-awareness stuff. But what it does is it adds a whole richness to the idea of exploring self, which actually is quite compatible with the literature on wisdom. In the psychological stuff around leadership, as we said before, you've got all this adult development stuff. In the wisdom literature, you've got stuff around self-transcendence. And there's a real crossover here, which is about being able to understand origins of self, the kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? The fluidity of self. This is kind of like Keegan level 5, the self-transforming mind. lovely ideas which are sitting in both kind of domains, both narratives. I also like to, in wisdom, bring in the idea of systemic thinking and the meta-systemic self, which is all in the systemic coaching book, and dialogue, because wisdom is also about my capacity to engage effectively with others. That's all sitting in the wisdom literature. It's clearly sitting there in the leadership literature. Great leaders, in most people's language, one of the things that characterizes is that they have this quite extraordinary capacity to be present and to engage. It takes us right back to what we were talking about before about dialogue. So the ideas that we're exploring at the moment is the value of capturing, defining wisdom in terms of those 5 aspects, and really seeking to bring them to life in a way that becomes practical. Because you were very kind in your introduction, but one of the things I try and do, whether successfully or not, is to bring some of this, what I was trying to do with the systemic stuff, is to bring some really quite complex stuff and extract from that the essence of it and make it practical. And that's what we're trying to do with the wisdom stuff as well.
What a wonderful ability to develop as a coach, to take all of this complexity and try to pick out some themes, to try and capture some patterns, maybe put something on the table that we observe and notice.
Well, it comes back to this idea that who I am is to an extent created in conjunction with others, which is true, right? I mean, if a whole load of people listen to this podcast and said, "Paul, you're really quite stupid, and here's why," I go, "Oh." I mean, it's going to, maybe I don't agree.
It'll have an impact. Yeah. How could it not?
Myself, right? It does. Yeah. Whatever I choose to do with that. And so this is the challenge for the coach. This wisdom stuff is entirely about coaching, because if you have a view that says, wouldn't it be great if all leaders were wiser? It says, well, that means you as coach, your job is to get wiser, because how you're showing up in that coaching relationship will have an impact on the person that you're working with. So the wiser we can become, then that has an impact on all of the people that we work with, a wonderful impact.
Yeah, because the attitude that we're being met with is going to have an impact on how these people meet other people. It's not that that I want my clients to recreate how I'm relating to people, but just being met with a perspective or an attitude or a way of being can be quite inspiring. Being met with such a tremendous amount of curiosity often makes people more curious.
Well, this is kind of what I was saying before, is no question or statement comes from a neutral place. It comes from somewhere. So just does. I mean, it might be a purely curious, clean question, but it's still coming from somewhere. It's coming from the way that I think. So if I'm really paying attention and just curious and committed to developing myself, then my questions and my statements are going to come from a wiser place.
Right. And so a key component of this, and you touched on this a couple of times, is that systems perspective, that broadening of our awareness to include different systems. And these are systems of what are perhaps multiple selves in me and how do I relate to them, but also how do I relate to other people in those kind of systems. We mentioned the environment earlier. Well, there's a huge system that we're all in. Could you tell us a bit more about why it's important to develop that perspective as a coach?
Yeah. So
other than part of wisdom.
Yeah. I mean, very practically. So I'm working with a coachee, and they say, actually, this might be an example in the book, but they say, yeah, I've just joined this company, and my line manager really wants me to speak up more in meetings. What do I do?
Right, then set a SMART goal.
And will help you to speak more effectively. If I'm looking at this, I'm going to try and avoid using the word systemic. If I'm looking at this in a broader way, then I'm curious about what's happening here, then, to cut a long story short, I might discover that what's actually going on here is that yes, my coachee is new to the organization. Their boss is even newer to the organization. Their boss is under pressure from their boss to drive the agenda forward. My coachee's boss actually, however, is really new and is really relying on my coachee to be driving the agenda forward. But my coachee isn't driving the agenda forward, and so my boss is getting very anxious. That perspective on things might lead me to think, wow, a presentation skills course, it isn't going to help at all. That's not what's going on here. So the broader the perspective, the more possibility we can see, the more we can, the more that we recognize that the way things operate is complex, the more curious we're going to be. Because if we go immediately, because we're very good at this, right? Because to do stuff, we need to reduce complexity to simple models. We do that. There's 1,000,001 2x2 matrices. And that's okay, as long as we recognize every time we're doing that, we're simplifying things. And as long as we don't take our simplified version of the world as the reality of the world, and we are just like, just irresistibly curious about what's going on more broadly. I don't like using the word systemic because I actually think even the complex systemic theories are somewhat limiting, because they say, they encourage us to think of the world in terms of systems and boundaried systems. So if you think of a team, some of the systemic stuff around teams says, think of the team as a system, which kind of implies it has a boundary around it. And you need to help this component of the system kind of sort its shit out. And of course, help the team interact more effectively with other components of the system, other subsystems. Sounds, quite like an attractive idea, but and I'm not trashing it, because there's going to be contexts in which that's a really useful, helpful way to think.
Yeah, just like setting a SMART goal and reaching it, how to be more assertive can be a really valuable thing to achieve.
And so in the systemic stuff, I don't call this the anti-systemic perspective. I call it the meta-systemic perspective, because it's saying the systems metaphors can be useful and sometimes they're not. And I'm not sure that they're always useful in a team environment, because when we say I've got 8 people in a team and here they're all working together, sorry, what's a team? What's a team? A team is a mental construct. It's not real. You've got 8 people in a room is what you've got. And those 8 people in the room have all sorts of relationships with lots of people, including the people who are not in the room. And if we overextend the system metaphor, then we can start to, that we become relatively blind to that. Yeah. The kind of meta-systemic perspective says, look, the world is just it's just about how many people there are. It's just this great social network. And what we're all trying to do is influence within that network. And then to make life easier for ourselves, we create things called teams and organizations and divisions, which is useful. And it's useful in the team coaching space, but it's not real. And that's important to acknowledge, because sometimes it's not useful.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. How do you navigate that in practice when you're coaching someone? Because you could spend a lot of time just exploring all the nested systems that the client finds themselves in, when often they come in wanting to figure out something that is quite specific and they have a very clear agenda to it. How do you introduce that perspective? How do you contract that? How much time do you spend on exploring them in their systems?
Well, I don't introduce the idea of nested systems because I'm not sure it's massively useful all the time.
You're being curious, right? Naturally, about the systems that they're in, without using the word, probably.
It comes back to what I was saying before. There'll be times, occasionally, when you get a sense that the person you're working with would actually find those kind of perspectives useful, in which case you may choose to share them. But that's not what, but the point, I come back to the point I made before. The more I'm challenging my own thinking, the more I'm kind of determined to access different ways of thinking myself, then what happens is the kind of questions and things that come out my mouth are going to change. So if I personally am committed to just exploring for myself the whole systems stuff, And by the way, I mean, my perspective is just a perspective. Other people will look at it and they come up with different perspectives. If I'm committed to really explore that myself, then I'm going to start, my curiosity is going to come from a broader area than just the space that says, what's your SMART goal? Right? My questions and my presence and the things that I say are going to challenge that person. Not because I'm trying to challenge them, but they're going to challenge that person because I'm going to be asking them quite difficult questions. Not because I want to ask a difficult question, but because those are difficult questions, and they're going to be faced with that question. And then, as a coach, of course, my choice is to think: does this seem to be a useful question, or does it not? And if it's not, then I might want to change my tack. If it is, I'm helping that person through the issue, through the question. I don't have to lecture them on Paul's perspective on systems,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And sometimes we ask a question and it doesn't land. And sometimes it's difficult when you feel that a question is going to be really helpful for this person, but they're not taking the question. They're just answering a different question.
Well, it comes back to what you were saying before about transformation. It's that lovely adage, which is old, which says meet the coachee where they are. And to an extent, we have to do that. So, I don't want to come and transform you and have you, if my agenda is to transform you and have you thinking metasystemically, well, I'm kind of meeting you where I am.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Have you been in a situation where you had a strong sense that a systems perspective would really help, and you were tremendously curious about, where this person is and how they relate, and they just didn't want to go there?
Yes. So I'm doing a lot of work with a particular organization at the moment, and have been doing through COVID and et cetera. And it's a professional services firm. And those firms are challenging to navigate from within. And they are notionally hierarchical. And so people, they kind of get quite stressed and anxious sometimes about how to navigate that, whether that's in terms of their own career advancement or getting stuff done. And so the questions that come from those can be really helpful. And to your point, sometimes not. Because sometimes your question this is this notion that, of adult development of subject-object. You just have to be aware that, and I don't think you have to kind of be patronizing here, that your way of thinking may not be saying, it isn't necessarily more advanced than the other person's way of thinking. Your way of thinking may simply be different to their way of thinking. And if my questions are coming from a place that's just making no sense, then I need to access a different way of thinking. And does that happen? It happens a lot. Just think about, one of the aspects of trying to navigate a social system, for example, successfully, is you need to be able to say no to people in a respectful way. We know there are lots of people who, I meet people a lot, coach people a lot, say, I just don't like saying no. I need to respect that. There's no point in lecturing people about why they need to say no. You need to meet that person where they are, understand what lies beneath the reluctance to say no. This gets back to dialogue. Get really curious about it and work from that place.
Yeah, and if you ask enough curious questions, very often people start to realize that not saying no, or never saying no, or rarely saying no, is going to have this or that impact on their lives. And just not assuming that that's not okay with them, but genuinely asking. And I think this is where there's a skill of being aware of what's going on for me. And again, maybe this comes full circle, trying to ask this question from a genuine point of curiosity. How's that working out for you? Because that how's that working out for you question can come across as, well, how's that working out for you versus how's that working out for you?
Yeah. And if you're coming from a purely dialogic space, then you have to be open to the possibility that it's fine if this person never says no.
Yeah. It might be working out for them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wonderful. I'm hesitant because I don't want to open that groups and teams box within the very limited time that we have available. I do want to ask, perhaps let me phrase it this way. A lot of coaches, they want to branch out into working with groups. They want to branch out into working with teams. I know there's a huge range of what it might mean to work with groups. Could be group coaching in a life coaching space, could be working with teams in an organization, could be leadership teams. There's a lot out there. So maybe let me ask, if somebody wanted to explore that more, what would you tell them? Maybe pointing them into a direction, or maybe just sharing a few kind of fundamental nuggets that might be really helpful for somebody to know who wants to explore that space.
So yeah, I'd go back to the 3Ps model, which you can apply to any discipline. So take team coaching. So there's an awful, if you want to help a team to become more effective, then there's an awful there's an awful lot that you kind of, if you want to be totally brilliant at that, there's an awful lot that you need to know. And it's not stuff you're going to pick up on a 2-day program or something, or a week's program. You possibly need to understand around how to help just people engage more effectively together. And I always talk about dialogue when I talk about that. You have to perhaps have some perspective around how people can manage conflict, how they can manage diversity, some of the principles around building a team. Team development, do you like the Tuckman model? Do you like, do you not like the Tuckman model? Do you like the Gersick model? There is so much there. Team dynamics. What's your perspective on team dynamics? What about virtual teams? And you're working with a virtual team. Trust. What's your views on trust? So, and you're not going to learn all that overnight. So, the 3Ps piece, I think, is a lovely kind of anchor for developing your own practice and being clear. And actually, there's a 4th P, which is progress. So it says, so what theories and philosophies do I ascribe to in the team coaching space? And I would encourage people not to just grab onto, doesn't matter what the model is, just grab onto so-and-so's model or so-and-so's model or so-and-so's model. I would encourage people to explore all these models. And I'd encourage them to explore lots of different models in terms of coming up with their own philosophy. And that philosophy is going to be continually evolving, because this whole area and team is massive. Ask yourself, second people, why am I doing this? I do a lot of supervision in the team coaching space, and I get a lot of coachees sometimes saying, why am I doing this? It's hard, right? Why are you doing it? And if I was a fly on the wall, what would I see you doing? Now, this is what tends to happen. I've noticed is a lot of people in the team coach space go straight to tell me what I need to do. The problem with that, I'll go on a course and they'll give me the script. That comes back to what we were saying before. You walk into a team, you're walking into an unknown territory. There is no formula. There is no script that's going to help you navigate that. So you kind of have to do the work, the philosophy, the purpose, and the practice, and recognize that this is a never-ending journey. So the 4th P is, and what are you going to learn next? What are you most interested in now? And throughout all of that, and this comes back to the wisdom piece, you just got to do the work. You've got to do the work, learn, reflect, do. And to your point, supervision, I kind of get it. Some coaches say, I don't know that I need supervision for my individual work. I'm not saying I agree with that. I don't know how the hell you do team coaching work without having somebody that you're working with on that basis to continually help you. What just happened? Well, I've got this team coming out. So there's the whole supervision piece around it. So, I'm not going to say, in answer to your question, I'm not going to say, do this, do this, do this. To me, it's more about the process, and acknowledge that if you want to be a team coach, brilliant. That's a journey. And how are you going to structure yourself along the journey? You might not like 3Ps, structure yourself another way, but you want to set yourself up to learn. You want to set yourself up to learn knowledge. You want to set yourself up to do the work and reflect on the work, and come up with your own model of team coaching.
Amazing. Paul, thank you so much. I think I'm going to let you go here. Is there something you wanted to tell coaches, next generation, some experienced coaches that might be listening? Is there a message you want to put out in the ether?
I don't think so. I'm actually probably more interested in hearing what people's response is to our conversation.
Yes, me too. Please respond. These conversations are meant to inspire more thoughts and more curiosity and more questions. So I'd love to hear some of those. Where can people find you if they wanted to kind of be more in your sphere? I know your website has a lot of resources on there. There's more conversations. Where would you point people to explore a bit more of Paul's world?
Well, you can just send me an email at paul@leadingsystemically.com. There are some resources on the leadingsystemically.com website, and there's also lots of coaching resources and so on the CCOrg's website. That's ccorgs.com.au. That was the organisation that I still do some work for them, and we've been posting kind of coaching stuff, free coaching stuff up on there for about the last 3 or 4 years.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for your work in this area. I think you're an important voice in coaching, and I think it makes coaching better. So, I appreciate your work, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Yannick, and thank you for your time.